Joe Smith, a 50-year-old trucker, knew the roads of America like the lines on his own calloused hand. 25 years of crisscrossing the country from north to south had left marks not only on his body, but also on his soul. Every mile traveled carried a story. Every rest stop held a memory. His truck, a metallic blue Peterbilt 389, was more than just a vehicle. Joe affectionately called it Thunder and treated it like an old friend. The long hours on the road had created an almost mystical bond between man and machine. Joe swore that Thunder sometimes talked to him through creaks and rumbles of the engine that only he understood. That Friday night, Joe was preparing for another trip, the cargo, cutting-edge electronics leaving Chicago, bound for New Orleans. Almost 1,000 miles of road awaited him, a journey that would normally take 2 days. But Joe was determined to do it in one. The reason for his rush wasn't greed or company pressure. It was something much more precious, a promise made to his only daughter, Mary. In 2 days, she would turn 16, and Joe had sworn he'd be there for her party. After so many missed birthdays, so many important dates sacrificed on the altar of duty and necessity, he couldn't fail this time. Before departing, Joe went through his usual routine. He meticulously checked every part of Thunder, from the tires to the engine. He filled the tank to the brim and checked the oil twice. In the cab, he arranged his belongings with the care of someone preparing a home for a long stay. His wife, Emily, appeared in the trucking company's yard shortly before he left. She brought a container of home-cooked food and a rosary that had belonged to her grandmother. "Joe, are you sure you don't want to wait until tomorrow morning?" she asked, concern evident in her brown eyes. "All this rush, I don't know. It doesn't feel right." Joe smiled, trying to disguise his own apprehension. "Don't worry, honey. I've made this trip hundreds of times. Besides, I promised our girl I'd be there for her birthday. I can't disappoint the princess, can I?" Emily sighed, knowing it was useless to argue. She handed the food container and the rosary to Joe. "Be careful, old man, and take this with you for protection." Joe took the rosary, feeling the weight of the beads worn by use. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he knew how much that object meant to Emily. He hung it on the rearview mirror, where it would gently swing with the truck's movement. "I'll call when I stop to rest," he promised, giving Emily a goodbye kiss. "Tell Mary that Daddy loves her very much." With a final wave, Joe started Thunder's engine. The truck responded with a powerful roar, as if it too was eager to hit the road. And so, man and machine set off into the night, leaving behind the lights of Chicago and the worries of the everyday world. The first hours of the journey passed without incident. Interstate 55, which connects Chicago to St. Louis, was busy as always. But Joe navigated the traffic with the skill of years of experience. The radio played old country hits, and Joe hummed along, feeling at peace with the world. Passing through Springfield, Illinois, Joe made his first stop for a quick coffee and to stretch his legs. At the gas station, he met Old Jack, another veteran trucker he had known for years. "Hey, Smith," called Old Jack, his grizzled mustache moving as he spoke. "Hitting the road at this hour? Thought you were old enough to know better than to mess with the night on the highway?" Joe laughed, but felt a slight discomfort at his friend's words. "It's nothing, old man. The night is just another challenge for us to overcome. Besides, I have an important commitment." Old Jack shook his head, his wrinkled face contorting into an expression of concern. "Be careful, Smith. There are things on the road that we don't understand, especially on that route to New Orleans. I've heard some stories." Joe was about to ask for more details when his cell phone rang. It was Mary. "Dad, where are you?" Her voice sounded anxious. "Hi, Princess. Daddy's on the road heading home. I'll get there in time for your party, don't worry." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Mary spoke again, her voice was choked. "Please, Dad, Be careful. I had a bad dream today. Promise you'll take care? Joe's heart tightened. Of course I promise, my love. They're just dreams. Don't worry. Daddy's made this trip 1,000 times. Nothing's going to stop me from being there for your birthday. After a few more words of comfort, Joe hung up the phone. He looked at old Jack, who was watching him with an indecipherable expression. You'd better go, Smith, said the old trucker. But remember, if you see anything strange on the road, anything out of the ordinary, don't stop, no matter what it is. Got it? Joe nodded, feeling a shiver run down his spine despite the warmth of the night. He said goodbye to his friend and returned to Thunder, the uneasiness growing in his chest. Back on the road, Joe tried to push away the gloomy thoughts. He focused on the journey, on the familiar landmarks passing by. Soon, he left Illinois behind, entering Missouri. The landscape changed, the city lights giving way to the darkness of the countryside. That's when the night started to get strange. First, it was the radio. The stations began to fluctuate, alternating between static and snippets of distorted music and voices. Joe frowned, tapping the device lightly, but to no avail. Fragments of enigmatic conversations mixed with songs he had never heard before, creating a disturbing cacophony. The portal will open when the moon is at its peak. They come by the road, always by the road. Don't look into their eyes, never look into their eyes. Finally, unable to bear the noise, Joe turned off the radio. The sudden silence in the cab was almost deafening. Then came the fog, dense and low. It seemed to sprout from the asphalt itself, swallowing the road ahead. Joe slowed down, his eyes straining to see through the opaque whiteness. The air inside the cab suddenly turned cold, and he could see his own breath forming small clouds in front of his face. That's when he saw the first apparition. At the side of the road, illuminated by the truck's headlights, stood a woman in a white dress. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes. Joe felt a shiver run down his spine. Where eyes should have been, there was only darkness. Two black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. He blinked, and the figure disappeared. I'm too damn tired, he muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes hard. But a part of him knew it wasn't just fatigue. Old Jack's words echoed in his mind. If you see anything strange on the road, don't stop. Joe gripped the steering wheel tighter, determined to continue. But things only got worse. The next few hours turned into a waking nightmare. Spectral figures appeared and disappeared in the fog. Children playing on the shoulder, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the night. A man hanging from a tree, his body swaying gently even without wind. A red-eyed dog running alongside the truck, keeping pace even when Joe accelerated. Joe gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white, his heart pounding frantically in his chest. He muttered long-forgotten prayers, promises to saints he wasn't sure he still believed in. The worst came when he looked in the rearview mirror and saw the passenger seat occupied. It was his father, Anthony Smith, dead 10 years from a truck accident. You shouldn't be driving, son, said the ghost, his voice a distant echo that seemed to come from far away. It's not safe. The road, it's hungry tonight. Joe screamed, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the seat was empty again. But the cold persisted, and he could swear he still felt his father's presence. The hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of terror. Joe didn't dare stop, fearing what he might encounter if he left the relative safety of his cab. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, shapes writhing at the edges of his vision. In a particularly frightening moment, Joe saw a procession of hooded figures crossing the road in front of him. They carried candles and chanted in a language he didn't recognize. For a moment, he considered stopping or swerving, but remembered old Jack's warning. Closing his eyes and praying, he drove through the procession. The truck passed through the figures as if they were made of smoke, but Joe felt as if he had plunged into ice-cold water. For a few seconds, voices whispered in his ears, incomprehensible words that made his blood run cold. When he finally emerged on the other side, Joe was shaking uncontrollably. He wanted to stop, wanted to call Emily and say he was coming back, that the promise to Mary wasn't worth his sanity or his life. But something compelled him to continue. It was then that Thunder began to act strangely. The engine, always so reliable, began to falter. The dashboard lights blinked for no apparent reason, and Joe could swear he heard voices coming from the air vents. Joe, stop now! Come join us! Desperate, he began to talk to the truck, as he did in difficult moments. Come on, old boy, he muttered, patting the dashboard. Don't abandon me now. We need to get home, remember? For Mary. As if responding to his plea, Thunder's engine roared with new life. The lights stabilized, and for a moment, Joe felt as if an invisible barrier had been erected around the truck, keeping the shadows of the night at bay. The following hours were a constant battle against sleep, fear, and the visions that continued to haunt him. Joe saw ghost towns appear out of nowhere by the roadside, heard screams and wails coming from the darkness, and on more than one occasion had to swerve to avoid obstacles that appeared and disappeared in seconds. Finally, when the first ray of sunlight broke the horizon, the fog began to dissipate. The apparition ceased, leaving only the empty road ahead. Joe let out a shaky sigh of relief, feeling as if he had aged years in a single night. He stopped at the first station he found, his legs shaking when he finally got out of the truck. The attendant, a young man no more than 20, looked at him with concern. You all right, Mr. Smith? You look like you've seen a ghost. Joe gave a shaky laugh. If only the kid knew. Just a tough night on the road, son, he replied, trying to sound casual. Tell me, has anything strange been happening around these parts lately? The attendant frowned, looking nervously around before answering in a low voice. Well, Mr. Smith, you're not the first to arrive here with that look of shock. People have been talking about weird things on the road at night. Apparitions, voices, strange lights. Some have even stopped traveling after sunset. Joe nodded, feeling a shiver run down his spine. So it wasn't just his imagination. Something really was happening on that road. After having a strong coffee and washing his face, Joe returned to Thunder. He hesitated for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the long stretch of road that still awaited him. For a moment, he considered giving up, going home, and forgetting all this madness. But then he remembered Mary, his promise. Taking a deep breath, he started the truck. Thunder responded with a powerful roar, as if it too was relieved to have survived the night. The next few hours of the journey were tense, but without supernatural incidents. Joe remained alert, half expecting the apparitions to return at any moment. But the daylight seemed to have driven away the terrors of the night, at least for now. When he finally arrived in New Orleans, Joe was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But a smile appeared on his face when he saw Mary and Emily waiting for him in the yard of the local trucking company. He had made it. Despite everything, he had arrived in time for his daughter's birthday. Mary ran to hug him as soon as he got out of the truck. Dad, you made it! I knew you'd come! Joe hugged her tightly, feeling tears in his eyes. I promised, didn't I, Princess? And a Smith always keeps his promises. Emily approached, her face a mixture of relief and concern. Joe, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. He gave a tired smile. Just tired from the trip, honey. Nothing a good shower and a good night's sleep won't fix. But as they headed home, Joe couldn't stop thinking about the events of the previous night. The apparitions, the voices, the feeling that the road itself was alive and hungry. It all seemed like a distant nightmare in the daylight, but he knew it was real. He knew something was wrong on America's roads, something that went beyond human understanding. In the days that followed, Joe tried to focus on Mary's party and the joy of being with his family. But at night, the nightmares came. He saw himself driving thunder down endless roads, pursued by shadows and voices. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, the scream of the woman with empty eyes still echoing in his ears. A week after his return, Joe decided he needed answers. He began to research, seeking information about strange events on American highways. To his surprise, he discovered that he wasn't alone in his experiences. In online forums and trucker WhatsApp groups, he found dozens of similar accounts. Drivers talking about apparitions, stretches of road that seemed to extend infinitely, voices on the radio, and shadowy figures on the shoulder. Some even mentioned the woman in the white dress with the empty eyes that Joe had seen. Intrigued and a little scared, Joe decided to delve deeper. He began to mark on a map the locations where strange events were most frequent. A pattern began to emerge. The occurrences seemed to concentrate on certain routes, especially those that cut through remote areas or passed through places with histories of tragedies or massacres. In one of his searches, Joe found an old book in a used bookstore. Legends of the Road, The Mysteries of American Asphalt, written by a folklorist named Jonathan Rivers. The book talked about urban legends and supernatural stories associated with the country's highways. One passage in particular caught Joe's attention. There is an old belief among travelers that roads have a life of their own. They are more than just paths. They are pulsing veins that cut through the earth, carrying not just vehicles and cargo, but also stories, fears, and secrets. In certain places, where the barrier between worlds is thinner, they say that roads can become portals. Portals to where? No one knows for sure. But those who have crossed these thresholds and returned have never been the same. Joe felt a chill as he read these words. They seemed to confirm his suspicions, give name to the terror he had experienced on that fateful night. Determined to discover more, Joe began to contact other truckers who had reported similar experiences. Many were reluctant to talk, fearing being ridiculed or considered crazy. But some, realizing that Joe truly understood what they had been through, opened up. Carlos, a trucker from Texas, told Joe about a night when his cab was invaded by black butterflies that whispered names of dead people. Maria, one of the few women in the profession, spoke of a ghost town that appeared out of nowhere, complete with inhabitants who seemed to have come from another era. Each story Joe heard only deepened his fascination and fear. He began to compile all this information, creating a detailed dossier on the phenomena of American roads. Meanwhile, his personal life began to suffer. Emily noticed his growing obsession, the sleepless nights researching, the maps and books scattered around the office. Mary noticed her father's distant look, as if part of him was still on that dark road. "Joe, you need to stop this," Emily pleaded one night, after finding him asleep over his papers once again. "This obsession isn't healthy. You're drifting away from us." Joe knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. He felt he was on the verge of an important discovery, something that could explain not just his experience, but perhaps even the deepest mysteries of the world. It was during this time that Joe met Madame Zora, an elderly lady who lived on the outskirts of New Orleans. He found her by chance when he stopped to ask for directions during one of his investigations. Something in her eyes, an ancient and somewhat frightening wisdom, made him hesitate. "You're the one who saw, aren't you?" asked Madame Zora, her cloudy eyes fixed on Joe. "The one who crossed the threshold and came back." Joe felt his heart race. How do you know that?" Madame Zora smiled, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. The roads speak to me, my child. They always have, and now they're talking about you. In the days that followed, Joe visited Madame Zora several times. She told him ancient stories, legends that predated the arrival of Europeans to America. She spoke of entities that inhabited Native American trails, spirits that had adapted to modern roads. The roads are like rivers, Joe, she explained. They flow with energy, with stories, and sometimes, in certain places and at certain moments, that energy overflows. That's when worlds mingle, when the veil between the natural and the supernatural becomes thin. Joe absorbed every word, feeling that he was finally getting close to the truth. But Madame Zora warned him. Be careful, my child. Knowledge is power, but it's also a burden. The more you know, the more the entities of the road will notice you, and not all of them are benevolent. These words proved to be prophetic. As Joe deepened his investigation, strange things began to happen, even when he wasn't on the road. Shadows moved in the corner of his eyes. The radio in his house sometimes picked up strange voices, even when it was turned off. And the nightmares became more vivid, more terrible. One night, Joe woke up screaming. In the dream, he was driving Thunder down an infinite road. Suddenly, the woman with empty eyes appeared in the passenger seat. But this time, she spoke. You opened the door, Joe. Now you can't close it anymore. Emily, startled by her husband's scream, held him tight. Enough, Joe, she said, tears in her eyes. This has to stop. You're destroying yourself. Joe looked at his wife, seeing the fear and concern in her eyes. He thought of Mary, of how he was drifting away from his family because of this obsession. At that moment, he made a decision. You're right, honey, he said, hugging Emily back. It's over. I'm going to stop all of this. In the days that followed, Joe tried to return to normalcy. He put away his maps and notes, deleted the forums from his favorites list. He tried to focus on his family, on his everyday life. But something had changed. Joe knew too much, had seen too much. The roads had marked him in a way that couldn't be undone. Weeks later, Joe received a call from his boss. An important cargo needed to be delivered to Los Angeles. It was a long trip that would require driving through the night. Joe hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to stay safe at home with his family. But another part, a part he didn't want to admit to, longed for the road, for the possibilities, for the mysteries. I'll do it, said Joe, feeling a shiver of anticipation and fear. That night, as he prepared to leave, Joe looked at Thunder. The old truck seemed different somehow, more alive, as if it too was eager to get back on the road. Joe turned to Emily and Mary, who had come to say goodbye. He hugged them tightly, promising he'd be back soon. But as he climbed into the cab, a part of him wondered if that promise would be kept. Starting the engine, Joe felt Thunder's familiar roar. But there was something more now, an almost imperceptible whisper underneath the engine noise, as if the road itself was calling to him. As the truck hit the highway, night was falling. Joe looked at the long stretch of asphalt ahead of him, disappearing into the darkness. What awaited him this time? What secrets would the road reveal? With a mixture of fear and excitement, Joe stepped on the accelerator. Thunder responded, surging forward into the night. And so, man and machine once again launched themselves into the unknown, ready to face the mysteries and terrors that the shadows of the road held. The road stretched out before him, infinite and mysterious. And Joe Smith, the trucker who had glimpsed the secrets of the asphalt, drove on, knowing that his journey was far from over. As he drove, Joe's mind wandered to all he had learned, all he had experienced. The woman with empty eyes, the ghostly processions, the voices in the static, they were all part of a larger tapestry, a hidden world that existed alongside our own. He thought of Madame Zora's words about the roads being like rivers of energy. Perhaps, he mused, that's why truckers were often the ones to experience these phenomena. They spent more time on these energy currents than anyone else, becoming attuned to their fluctuations and mysteries. The night deepened, and Joe found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to hold potential for the extraordinary. Every flicker of his headlights could be revealing something just beyond normal perception. Around midnight, Joe entered a stretch of highway that cut through a dense forest. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The darkness between the trunks seemed absolute, impenetrable. It was here that Joe saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, directly in his path. It was the woman in the white dress, her empty eyes seeming to bore into his soul. Joe's instinct was to swerve, to avoid her at all costs. But a voice in his head, sounding suspiciously like Madame Zora, whispered, "Don't turn away, face it." With his heart pounding, Joe kept the truck steady, heading straight for the apparition. As Thunder's front grille was about to make contact, the woman dissolved into mist, swirling around the truck before reforming behind it. Joe let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He'd faced the entity and passed through unscathed. But why? What did it mean? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the radio crackled to life. Through the static, a voice, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, spoke. "You've taken the first step, Joe Smith. The road has accepted you, but beware. To walk between worlds is to invite both wonder and danger. Your journey is just beginning." The radio went silent, leaving Joe with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. He had been right. There was more to the road than met the eye. And now, for better or worse, he was part of it. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Joe saw a sign indicating he was nearing Los Angeles. The night's events felt almost dreamlike in the growing light, but he knew they had been real. Pulling into the delivery depot, Joe shut off Thunder's engine. He sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel, reflecting on all that had transpired. He knew his life had changed irrevocably. The road had shown him its secrets, and there was no going back. As he climbed down from the cab, Joe patted Thunder's side. "Thanks, old friend," he murmured. "I have a feeling we've got many more adventures ahead of us." Walking towards the depot office, Joe felt a new sense of purpose. Yes, the road held dangers and terrors, but it also held wonders and mysteries beyond imagination. And he, Joe Smith, simple trucker, turned road mystic, was going to explore them all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last wisps of night's magic. But Joe knew that when darkness fell again, the other world would reawaken, and he would be ready for it. For now, though, it was time to call Emily and Mary, to reassure them he was safe. Then, perhaps, a few hours of sleep before the next journey. After all, the road was calling, and Joe Smith had finally learned how to listen. The end.